Hello and welcome to Curated Classics, the channel that shares the most famous and popular stories from books, films, and history in quick summaries, so that you can learn the classics quickly without hours of reading or years of expensive courses. Today you are listening to Dubliners by James Joyce as a collection of 15 short stories, each capturing a moment or an event in the life of a resident of Dublin, Ireland. The book explores themes of stagnation, paralysis, and the weight of social and political norms on individuals. Here is a brief summary of each story. The Sisters. A young boy reflects on the death of his friend, Father Flynn, a priest. The boy grapples with the priest's confusing legacy and the nature of death. An Encounter. A boy skips school with his friends to explore the city, encountering a strange man who forces them to confront the adult world's complexities. Araby. A young boy experiences his first crush on his friend's sister and promises to bring her a gift from the Araby bazaar, only to encounter disappointment. Eveline. A young woman contemplates escaping her abusive father and dull life by eloping to Buenos Aires with her lover, but in the end is unable to do so. After the race, a young Irishman, Jimmy Doyle, tries to fit in with his wealthy European friends, leading to financial disaster. Two Gallants, two men, Lennian and Corley, exploit women for their own gains in a depiction of parasitic relationships. The boarding house, Mrs. Mooney manipulates her tenant, Mr. Doran, into marrying her daughter to secure a better future for her. A Little Cloud, little Chandler feels dissatisfaction with his life and envy towards his friend, Gallagher, who has become a successful journalist in London. Counterparts, Farrington, a copy clerk, struggles with the monotony and frustration of his job and takes out his anger on his son. Clay, Maria, a maid, celebrates Halloween with the family she used to nurse. She is well loved, but also pitied due to her loneliness and simple-mindedness. A Painful Case, Mr. Duffy lives a life of rigid routine until he forms a bond with Mrs. Sinico. After breaking off their relationship, he learns of her tragic death years later. Ivy Day, in the committee room, a group of canvassers discuss politics and the death of Charles Stewart Parnell, a revered Irish nationalist. A mother, Mrs. Kearney, tries to secure a better future for her daughter, Kathleen, by organizing a series of concerts, but her efforts are thwarted by ineptitude and disrespect. Grace. After a man named Mr. Kernan injures himself in a drunken fall, his friends try to persuade him to reform his ways. The Dead. Gabriel Conroy attends an annual holiday party with his wife, Greta. After the party, Greta reveals a past love, leading Gabriel to a profound realization about mortality in his own life. Each story in Dubliners offers a glimpse into the characters' lives and the society they live in, providing a portrait of Dublin at the turn of the 20th century. Joyce's keen observations about life, love, death, and societal norms continue to resonate with readers today. For a more in-depth understanding of the book, we will now provide a chapter-by-chapter breakdown. The Sisters is the first story in James Joyce's Dubliners. In this story, a young, unnamed boy recounts the recent death of his friend, Father James Flynn. Father Flynn had been a mentor to the boy, educating him about various aspects of Catholic doctrine and history. The boy has a strange fascination with the priest, whose physical and mental health had been deteriorating. The story begins with the boy learning about Father Flynn's death through a conversation he overhears from his aunt. The boy later sees a symbolic image, the priest's death notice, and a card with a prayer for the dead bordered by a mourning frame in the window of Father Flynn's house. After Father Flynn's death, the boy and his aunt visit the house to pay their respects. There they meet the priest's sisters, Eliza and Nanny. They discuss the priest's last days, and Eliza shares that Flynn had suffered from paranoia, believing that someone was out to get him. She attributes this mental decline to his job, specifically the strain of a chalice he had dropped, a moment of clumsiness during Mass, which she believes led to his downfall. The Sisters is a complex story of loss, with the theme of paralysis that is central to the entire collection of Dubliners. It explores the boy's coming of age and the loss of his innocence, the influence of the Catholic Church and its doctrines, as well as the decline and death of a man tormented by his past mistakes. An Encounter is the second short story in James Joyce's collection Dubliners. The story is narrated by a man recalling an incident from his childhood. The unnamed narrator and his friend Mahoney decide to play truant from school and explore Dublin. They are bored with their everyday lives and fascinated by the more exotic and exciting world of the Wild West they read about in their adventure books. They decide to have their own adventure for a day. On the morning of the planned day, the narrator collects his share of the money they have saved for this adventure, and the two boys meet up and head out to explore the city. They wander through several areas of Dublin, ultimately crossing over the river to Ringsend, a somewhat unsavory area of the city. There, they encounter a strange older man who engages them in conversation. Initially, the man talks about normal subjects like sweethearts and books, but his conversation soon turns inappropriate as he begins to talk about whipping boys. The man's unsettling behavior and talk make the narrator uncomfortable, but Mahoney, who has been off chasing a cat, returns and the man leaves. When the man comes back, the narrator decides to leave, but the man detains Mahoney, so the narrator waits for his friend. Eventually, Mahoney breaks free from the man and runs towards the narrator. They leave the area together, ending their adventure. The story captures the transition from the innocence of childhood to the complexities of the adult world. It portrays the boys' encounter with the world outside of their familiar surroundings and their confrontation with the potentially dangerous aspects of adulthood. The third story in James Joyce's Dubliners is Araby. In this story, an unnamed young boy lives a quiet life in North Richmond Street in Dublin. The boy develops a crush on his friend's sister, who is unnamed in the story. He is infatuated with her and constantly watches her from his house, waiting for her to leave her home so he can follow her from a distance. The girl eventually speaks to the boy one day, asking if he plans to go to Araby, a bazaar in town. She expresses her wish to go there, but she cannot as she has a retreat for her convent. The boy, eager to win her favor, promises to bring her something from the bazaar if he goes. The boy is excited about his planned trip to the bazaar, but his uncle, who is supposed to give him money and accompany him, forgets about his promise. By the time the boy's uncle comes home and gives him the money, it's late. The boy rushes to the bazaar but arrives as it's about to close. Inside, he sees that many stalls are closed and he doesn't buy anything. He realizes the vanity of his desires and the harsh reality contrasting with the romantic fantasies he had about Araby and his feelings for his friend's sister. Araby is a story of first love and the disappointment that often accompanies the harsh realities of life when contrasted with the idealized world created by youthful romanticism. It continues the theme of paralysis in Dubliners as the boy, despite his intentions, fails to accomplish his goal due to circumstances beyond his control. The fourth story in James Joyce's Dubliners is Eveline. Eveline is a young woman living in Dublin with her abusive father and younger siblings. She works a tiresome job at the stores, a local shop, to support her family. She often recalls memories of her childhood, particularly of her mother's death and her promise to her mother to keep the home together as long as she could. Eveline is in a relationship with a sailor named Frank, who is kind and promises her a better life in Buenos Aires. Tired of her life in Dublin, and fearing that her father might escalate his violence towards her, Eveline decides to elope with Frank, who offers her love and a fresh start. As Eveline prepares to leave her home, she starts having second thoughts. She remembers the positive aspects of her past, her loyalty to her family, and the promise she made to her mother. Her desire for freedom is weighed down by her sense of duty and fear of the unknown. On the day of the departure, Eveline and Frank are at the dock waiting for the ship to Buenos Aires. As the ship is about to leave, Eveline is paralyzed by fear and cannot board. Frank calls out to her, but she remains on the quay, frozen. The story ends with Eveline watching Frank being carried away, feeling helpless and trapped. Eveline explores the themes of obligation, family, and the struggle between desire and duty. It portrays the struggle of a young woman torn between her duty towards her family and her desire for personal happiness. The fifth story in James Joyce's Dubliners is After the Race. In this story, a young Irishman named Jimmy Doyle tries to fit in with his wealthy European friends. The story opens with a description of a motor race, the Gordon Bennett Cup, which has brought together a group of wealthy men from different nationalities. Jimmy Doyle, the son of a self-made businessman, is thrilled to be part of this group. He is fascinated by the glamour and sophistication of his new friends, particularly a Frenchman named Charles Seguin, the owner of the car they are riding in. The group also includes a Hungarian named Vilona and a Canadian named Riviere. Despite the wealth his father has accumulated, Jimmy's financial status is not as secure as his friends. His father has worked hard to give him the best education and ensure his entry into high society. However, the lifestyle Jimmy is trying to maintain is draining his resources. After the race, the group goes to dinner and then to Seguin's hotel, where they play cards. Jimmy, who is already in debt, ends up losing more money in the card game. Though he feels a moment of panic, he continues to play, desperate to win and prove himself. The story ends with Jimmy feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, realizing that he is out of his depth. He's caught in a cycle of trying to keep up with his wealthier friends, which only leads to further financial trouble. After the Race explores the themes of social aspiration, the illusion of glamour, and the consequences of trying to maintain a lifestyle beyond one's means. It continues the motif of paralysis seen in Dubliners, with Jimmy trapped by his desire to fit in and his financial limitations. The sixth story in James Joyce's Dubliners is Two Gallants. The story centers around two men, Linehan and Corley, who roam around Dublin scheming ways to get by with minimal work. Corley, the dominant one, has a reputation for exploiting women, and Linehan, who is somewhat envious of Corley's success, is more of a follower. Corley has convinced a housemaid to steal from her employer, and he is waiting for her to bring him the promised stolen item. While Linehan wanders around Dublin contemplating his own bleak existence, Linehan feels a sense of emptiness and dissatisfaction with his life but feels powerless to change his situation. After Lennon finishes his meal at a cheap restaurant, he walks back to the agreed spot to meet Corley. Corley finally arrives with the woman. He separates from her and walks towards Linehan, who is anxious to know whether Corley's plan has worked. In the end, Corley shows Linehan a gold coin, indicating that the housemaid has fulfilled her promise. The story concludes with Corley's triumph, highlighting the exploitation of a woman's trust and loyalty for personal gain. Two Gallants is a darker story in the collection, exploring themes of deception, exploitation and moral decay. The two protagonists exhibit a form of paralysis, trapped in their lifestyles of deceit and petty crime, seemingly unable to break free from this cycle. The seventh story in James Joyce's Dubliners is The Boarding House. Mrs. Mooney, the proprietor of a boarding house, is a woman who, after escaping a violent marriage, has learned to be pragmatic and shrewd. Her daughter, Polly, a young and attractive girl, also lives in the boarding house. Mrs. Mooney uses Polly as bait to attract young men to stay at the boarding house, hoping to arrange a beneficial marriage for her daughter. Mr. Doran, one of the residents, starts a relationship with Polly. Mrs. Mooney, aware of their relationship, waits until she believes that Mr. Doran is so entangled with Polly that he will have no choice but to marry her. When she deems the time right, she confronts Mr. Doran about his intentions towards her daughter. Mr. Doran, worried about his reputation and job, he works at a Catholic wine merchant's office, feels pressured to propose marriage. Despite his reservations about Polly's social standing and behavior, he is aware of the social and professional consequences of refusing to marry her after their intimate relationship. In the end, it is implied that Mr. Doran agrees to marry Polly. The final scene sees Polly waiting for her mother to bring the news, singing to herself and confident in the knowledge that she has secured a husband. The boarding house delves into themes of social expectation, the role of women in society, and the power dynamics in relationships. It also explores the limitations and opportunities that society provides for women, exemplified in Mrs. Mooney's pragmatic approach to securing her daughter's future. The eighth story in James Joyce's Dubliners is A Little Cloud. The story focuses on a man named Thomas Chandler, also known as Little Chandler, due to his small stature and quiet demeanor. Little Chandler lives a life of routine with a steady job, a wife, and a newborn child. He dreams of becoming a poet, but his shyness and self-doubt have kept him from pursuing his dream. The story begins with Little Chandler preparing to meet his old friend, Ignatius Gallagher, who has become a successful journalist in London. Little Chandler hasn't seen Gallagher in 8 years, and he admires Gallagher's worldly lifestyle and professional success. During their meeting at a local pub, Gallagher tells Little Chandler about his travels, his career, and his cynical views on marriage. Little Chandler feels both envious of Gallagher's success and disillusioned by his coarse attitude. Returning home, Little Chandler looks at his sleeping infant son and begins to daydream about becoming a famous poet. However, when his son wakes up and starts crying, he yells at him, which prompts his wife to rush in and scold Little Chandler for upsetting the baby. The story ends with Little Chandler feeling trapped and crying at his failed dreams. A Little Cloud explores the theme of paralysis, a recurring motif in Dubliners. Little Chandler is a character trapped by his own personality, his social circumstances, and his responsibilities, and he is unable to pursue his dreams of becoming a poet. The story contrasts the familiar domesticity of Little Chandler's life with the excitement of Gallagher's cosmopolitan lifestyle. The ninth story in James Joyce's Dubliners is Counterparts. This story revolves around the life of Farrington, a clerk who works for a law firm in Dublin. Farrington, a man of large physique and strong temper, finds his job tedious and his boss, Mr. Allain, unbearable. He is frequently reprimanded for his inadequate job performance. One day, after being humiliated by Mr. Allain, Farrington decides to take a break from work. He goes to a pub and spends his money on alcohol to escape his frustration. However, he quickly runs out of money and pawns his watch to continue drinking. Throughout the day, Farrington returns to the pub multiple times, each time growing more desperate and angry. His work suffers, and he's reprimanded again by Mr. Allain. After work, Farrington goes to a pub where he engages in an arm wrestling match with a visiting Englishman. He loses the match, which further frustrates him. When Farrington finally returns home late at night, he finds his family has been waiting for him to cut the meat for dinner. In his anger and frustration, he lashes out violently at his young son Tom, who pleads for mercy. Counterparts is one of the more grim stories in Dubliners, exploring themes of frustration, anger, alcoholism, and the cycle of abuse. Farrington, feeling trapped in his monotonous job and powerless against his boss, takes out his anger on his innocent son, thus perpetuating the cycle of abuse. The story portrays a stark picture of domestic violence and the harmful effects of alcoholism. The 10th story in James Joyce's Dubliners is Clay. The protagonist of this story is Maria, an older, unmarried woman who works at a Protestant charity for troubled women. She's well respected and loved by everyone for her kindness and good nature. Maria is preparing for a Halloween party at the house of Joe Donnelly, a man she used to nurse when he was a child. As Maria travels to the party, she stops to buy cakes for the occasion. She's excited about the celebration and even flirts with a gentleman at the bakery. However, she realizes on the tram that she has lost one of the cakes she bought. At the party, she plays games with Joe's children and sings a song. During a traditional Irish Halloween game, where items are placed in a pudding and each item has a symbolic meaning, Maria unintentionally chooses a lump of clay, which traditionally signifies death. She plays off the event lightly, but the mood becomes somewhat somber. Later, Maria tries to sing a song, but she forgets the lyrics halfway through, leading to a quiet and slightly awkward moment. Joe, touched by the song and perhaps a little drunk, gets emotional and speaks about how much he cares for Maria, ending the story on a bittersweet note. Clay explores themes of aging, loneliness, and the passage of time. Despite the seeming simplicity of Maria's life, there is a sense of melancholy and missed opportunities. It continues the theme of paralysis in Dubliners as Maria, despite her kindness and warm heart, leads a life of routine and unfulfilled desires. The 11th story in James Joyce's Dubliners is a painful case. The protagonist of the story is Mr. James Duffy, a middle-aged man who lives a life of rigid routine and self-imposed isolation in a suburb of Dublin. He has few friends and avoids relationships, valuing his independence and intellectual pursuits above all. One day, Mr. Duffy strikes up a friendship with Miss Emily Sinico, a woman he meets at a concert. They start seeing each other regularly, discussing literature and sharing their thoughts. Over time, their relationship deepens, and one evening, Miss Sinico impulsively takes Mr. Duffy's hand and presses it to her cheek. Surprised by this show of affection, Mr. Duffy decides to end their relationship to maintain his solitary life. 4 years later, Mr. Duffy reads in the newspaper that Mrs. Sinico has been hit by a train and killed. The report suggests that she may have been drunk and implies that it could have been a suicide. The article also reveals that after Mr. Duffy ended their relationship, Miss Sinico fell into depression and began drinking. Mr. Duffy is initially indifferent, but as he reflects on the news, he begins to feel a deep sense of regret and loneliness. He realizes that his rejection may have led Mrs. Sinico down the path to her demise. He confronts his own solitude and acknowledges the emptiness of his life. A painful case explores themes of isolation, regret, and the human need for companionship. Mr. Duffy's self-imposed isolation is seen as a form of emotional paralysis that ultimately leads to despair and loneliness. The 12th story in James Joyce's Dubliners is Ivy Day in the Committee Room. Unlike the previous stories, this one focuses less on a single protagonist and more on a group of characters. It's set in a committee room where several minor politicians and campaign workers have gathered on Ivy Day, a day dedicated to the memory of Charles Stewart Parnell, a revered Irish nationalist leader. The men, who are supposed to be canvassing votes for a city council candidate, spend their time chatting, drinking, and waiting for a promised delivery of beer. They discuss various topics, including the current political situation, the lack of effective leadership compared to Parnell's time, and the overall decline of Ireland's political integrity. As the day progresses, an old nationalist named Hines enters the room and reads a sentimental poem he wrote in memory of Parnell. The poem reflects the disillusionment with the current political state and the longing for the past era of Parnell, who had fought for Irish independence. Ivy Day in the Committee Room is a somber reflection on the state of Irish politics and the decline of the national spirit. The story doesn't follow a traditional narrative structure. Instead, it provides a snapshot of the characters' attitudes and feelings about Ireland's political climate. The themes of paralysis and stagnation, common in Dubliners, are evident here in the political inertia and the men's inaction. The 13th story in James Joyce's Dubliners is A Mother. This story centers around Mrs. Kearney, a middle-class woman who is determined to provide her daughter, Kathleen, with a good education and exposure to the arts. Mrs. Kearney arranges for Kathleen to perform as an accompanist in a series of concerts organized by a committee of nationalists who are promoting Irish culture. However, the concerts are poorly organized, and attendance is disappointing. As the concerts progress, Mrs. Kearney becomes increasingly concerned about the committee's ability to pay Kathleen's agreed-upon fee. After the penultimate concert, she insists that they pay her daughter's fee up front before the final concert. The committee members are taken aback by her demands and try to negotiate a post-dated payment. Mrs. Kearney refuses and, in the end, prevents Kathleen from performing at the final concert when the committee fails to meet her terms. The story ends with a confrontation between Mrs. Kearney and the concert's reciter, Mr. Bell, who accuses her of having a mercenary attitude. Mrs. Kearney, however, remains adamant, believing that she's only ensuring her daughter's fair treatment. A mother presents a strong-willed, assertive female character in Mrs. Kearney, a departure from the more passive or victimized female characters in previous stories. The story explores themes of art versus commerce, social aspirations, and the clash between the individual and the community. The recurring theme of paralysis in Dubliners is also present, with Kathleen being the passive victim of her mother's ambitions and the committee's ineptitude. The 14th story in James Joyce's Dubliners is Grace. The protagonist of the story is Mr. Tom Kernan, a tea merchant who has fallen on hard times both personally and professionally. The story begins with him having a drunken accident in a pub bathroom. His friends find him unconscious, and after he recovers, they convince him to attend a spiritual retreat for Catholic men at a Jesuit church. Mr. Kernan's friends, Mr. Power, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. M'Coy, and Mr. Fogarty are all concerned about his drinking and believe that a return to religious observance might help him. Kernan is initially resistant, but eventually agrees to attend the retreat. The latter part of the story focuses on the retreat itself. The priest gives a sermon about the nature of sin and the necessity of repentance, using the concept of grace as a spiritual cure-all. The men listen, each responding in their own way, and the story ends on an uncertain note, leaving it open whether Kernan or any of the others will truly change. Grace deals with themes of spiritual awakening, the struggle with personal flaws, and the role of religion in society. It continues the motif of paralysis in Dubliners with Kernan's alcoholism and his friends' well-intentioned but possibly misguided efforts to reform him serving as examples of personal and spiritual stagnation. The 15th and final story in James Joyce's Dubliners is The Dead. The Dead is the longest story in the collection and is often considered a novella. It takes place during an annual holiday party hosted by Kate and Julia Morkan, two elderly sisters, and their niece, Mary Jane. The story's protagonist is Gabriel Conroy, a well-educated man who prides himself on being more sophisticated than his peers. Gabriel's wife, Greta, is also central to the story. During the party, Gabriel experiences several uncomfortable interactions, including a confrontation with a fellow guest, Miss Ivers, who accuses him of being a West Briton for writing for a conservative newspaper. After the party, as Gabriel and Greta prepare to leave, Greta becomes entranced by a song sung by one of the guests. The song reminds her of Michael Fury, a young man who was in love with her when she was a girl in Galway. Greta later reveals to Gabriel that Fury died young, and she believes it was due to his heartbreak when she moved to Dublin. Hearing this story, Gabriel realizes that Greta had a deep emotional life that he never knew about. He feels a mix of jealousy and sadness, understanding that he could never inspire the same passion in Greta as Fury did. As Gabriel contemplates his wife's past and their life together, he experiences a profound epiphany about the transience of life and the inevitability of death. The Dead is often regarded as one of Joyce's best works, exploring themes of love, loss, mortality, and the complexity of human relationships. It concludes Dubliners on a poignant note, encapsulating the collection's recurring motifs of paralysis and epiphany. Thanks for listening to Curated Classics. If you enjoyed this story and it provided valuable insights, we hope you will give this video a like by clicking the thumbs up, sharing it with other lifelong learners. And please check out more of the greatest stories throughout history on the Curated Classics channel. See you next time.